All right, my name is Gary Brandenburger, and I'll be telling the story of my late wife, Linda Brandenburger, and her adventure starting at a very early age, working toward transplant. In 2001, Linda was lying in what would be her deathbed in the ICU in Pittsburgh, University of Pittsburgh, and she was undergoing a really rough time toward the end with transplant rejection. I had met a family in the waiting room whose grown daughter had just had a heart-lung transplant, and they were very, very afraid. And I talked to them and consoled them a little bit and told Linda about this, and she said, well, please bring them in. So I brought the mother of this woman who had just had her heart-lung transplant in. And Linda then talked to her for about a half hour, just telling her about what was happening, about how scary it is, and how it's the way to look at it is it's the rebirth of this person's life, her daughter's life. And Linda gave her just a really wonderful time of exploring what's going to happen and reassuring her that everything was okay. So that was Linda at the end of her life doing what she was really destined to do, which was to be a nurse counselor to people going through medical crisis. And that was the last thing she did before she died. The story really begins when she was born, a cute little redhead with freckles and very blue lips. She was born with a condition called truncus arteriosus, which is fatal. Most children don't make it past infancy, but a very few actually make it into adulthood, and that was Linda. They didn't know that at the time. They didn't know whether she would last a week, a day, a week, a month. But she did, and she went through childhood. Her parents wisely raised her just like one of the other two girls. And she was a very brave little girl, very smart, pretty tough cookie, and managed to survive and to really do well in school and do well in life, despite the fact that she had a very deformed heart, had physical limitations that would stop many of us, and very blue lips. The story where I come in picks up when I was 11 and she was 12 in 1961. Her family had moved from Chicago to St. Louis, and a mutual friend of my mother, through my mother, introduced our two families, and our two families began to get together. And Linda and I were closest in age, so we were the ones that were together, and we played together. The families got together a number of times, and our mothers developed a really good relationship, a good friendship. The fathers didn't, so the families quit getting together, but the mothers stayed in touch over the years. So I always knew about this Linda who I'd met, the girl with blue lips and red hair. And fast forward to almost 10 years later, Linda transfers to Washington University from Webster, something she didn't want to do, but for a variety of reasons I won't go into. She was forced to go there, and she was very, very angry about it. And my mother told her mother, well, perhaps it would help if Gary would show her around the campus. And so it was arranged that I would take Linda on a tour, and so I did. So we met on the appointed day in fall and took her around, and we struck up a conversation, and by the end of the time we decided, well, maybe we'll get together for lunch on Wednesdays. So we got together for lunches and talked of many, many things, got to know each other pretty well. Both of us mindful of the fact, though, that going back in time, when she was 16, Mayo Clinic developed the surgery to correct her problem. And she and her mother went to Mayo Clinic on the train, spent a week in very intensive evaluation, showed her all the things that were going to happen to her, the heart-lung machine. There's a picture of her standing next to it. But at the end, one of the doctors, Dwight Magoon, had some doubt. And he did one new test that was fairly recently developed that showed that, in fact, she couldn't have the surgery, that she would not survive it. So at the end, they told her, well, sorry, we can't help you. It's too late. The only hope for you is science fiction. It would be a heart-lung transplant. So go home, go to college, but don't go to nursing school, which was her dream, to go to nursing school. But don't do that. It's too strenuous. It wouldn't be good for you. And don't get married, certainly. So it's basically go home and have what's left of your life. So she went home and did go to college, did exceptionally well, transferred to WashU. We met, but we both were knowledgeable of the fact that she couldn't get married and she couldn't go to nursing school. But about 6 months into this, our friendship developed. She finally said, to hell with all of them. She got a grant and got into nursing school at St. Luke's, graduated top in her class, which was typical of Linda, despite the blue lips and all the physical limitations. And she and I continued to have a friendship, which was only a friendship because we knew she could never get married. So back in the back of our minds, we kept it as just a very nice friendship. Of course, unbeknownst to us, we had fallen madly in love with each other, but we're in deep, deep denial of it. And before long, people began to realize there was something going on here. Her mother knew, my mother knew, her pastor knew, everybody knew but us. And finally, one day, as she was getting ready to graduate from nursing school, we went out looking for cars because she was going to get a job and buy a car. And during that time, we got to talking, and she said, well, you know, at this age, I wouldn't be ready for marriage if I were going to get married. And I said, yeah, me too. And for some reason, I'll never know why, before the end of the day, I parked the car at the last dealer we went to, a Dawson dealer. And I stopped the car and looked at her and said, but when you are ready to get married, would you marry me? And she said, yeah. So we went into the dealer, came back out to the car and looked at each other and said, oh my God, we're engaged. We had to tell our parents. Holy smoke, what are we going to do? Well, everybody knew, so everybody laughed. It was a wonderful thing, and we got married. I went on to graduate school. She went through, got her bachelor's degree at St. Louis U, got a master's degree. We wound up in first Virginia, then in Seattle, then in Boston. And she continued to go forward with increasing problems with her health. And we pretty much knew that time was growing short. We knew this wouldn't last forever. I worked in the field of cardiology, and my friends, pediatric cardiologists, told me, get her on a transplant list because heart-lung transplant is now no longer science fiction. You can do this. And she resisted that, and finally one day she continued to resist, but her mother sent her a newspaper clipping from the Phoenix area, and it was about a woman, approximately our age, who had had a heart-lung transplant. And it was successful, and she got interviewed by the newspaper, was on TV talking about this bold new thing that happened to her. And Linda thought, well, maybe this could happen. So we went to Phoenix. We met with this woman who'd had the transplant. And Linda finally decided, well, maybe this could happen. We got on the list. The only place it would take us was Pittsburgh. So we went for evaluation. She went through the evaluation fine. They said, okay, you're in the program, you're on the list. And we thought, well, good. Well, maybe in 4 years we'll get a call and this will happen. We got back to St. Louis, and a few weeks later she crashed. We took an air ambulance to Pittsburgh, and she went into the intensive care unit. And there she stayed in the ICU for 9 months waiting to see if we would get a heart and lungs. Time grew short. We were just about at the end, running out of options. The medication that kept her alive wasn't working anymore, and suddenly the heart and lungs appeared. And she got her transplant. This is in July of 1996. By then, she was a very skinny, 99 pounds, a very, very sick woman. But she got her transplant, and we knew that if it worked, if she got her transplant, her lips would go from blue to pink. So friends had made T-shirts, and we all wore T-shirts that said, "Think Pink." And I went into the recovery room where she was, and she was lying there still unconscious, I thought. If you picked up her arm and dropped it, she wasn't there. And I looked at her, and I cried. And she later recalled that, in fact, she was awake. She couldn't move, but she was awake. And she said, you kept saying, your lips are pink, your lips are pink. And her lips were pink. So after a very horrible recovery, it was very, very difficult. And then at one point, it was so difficult, she said, I would give up, except that I feel an obligation to the donor of this heart and lungs. I've got to go on with this. And she overcame it, and she recovered, and I brought her back to St. Louis. And the next 5 years were a gift that I'm at a loss for words to describe. We could climb in mountains for the first time. She could go to aerobics classes. Her lips were pink. She did things she'd never dreamed were possible. And a niece who was really like a daughter to us. We couldn't have children, of course, but a niece who was like a daughter to us had her first child, and Linda had the privilege of becoming Aunt Grandma. It was a wonderful experience. And so for 5 years, we got a bonus gift of not just an extra 5 years of life, but of 5 years that could never have been imagined. Toward the end of that 5 years, a mistake was made. They did an evaluation that, in fact, triggered rejection. It was something that other centers had stopped doing, but Pittsburgh did it. And it's a long story. I won't go into the details, but a series of mistakes led to her passing away. But at the end, she gave her last gift. She'd been a nurse all of her career, specializing in crisis management for people going through medical crisis, and she did that all the way to the end. And we had a 28-year love story that neither of us could have ever imagined. When I married her, I thought maybe we'd be lucky to have 5 years, maybe 10. Neither of us thought we'd have 28, nor would we possibly have known that it would be 28 years, unlike anything either of us could have imagined. So, but one of the things that Linda did shortly after coming back from her surgery was she found out that a small group of people had gotten together to form a support group. They called it Second Wind. And Linda became the newsletter editor and one of the co-founders, along with a number of other people who have all passed now. And Second Wind was born basically around 1997, 98 by Linda and this small group of people. And even though the original founders, including Linda, are gone, Second Wind has blossomed and grown into what we know today. And so it's part of a legacy by Ted Tunison, Larry Kaufman, and others who created this legacy that would live on beyond them. And that's how this all came to be today. That's why we're here now, is that Tom Archer came in and took up the gauntlet after Ted Tunison became too ill to be the president anymore, and took us to this great place we are now. So in a sense, that's the story of Linda, but it's tightly interwoven with my story, the story of a little girl with blue lips who did the impossible.